CGI, which stands for computer-generated images, has both its pros and cons. While good CGI can make for a magical experience that viewers will never forget, if it's done badly, it will probably give you nightmares. Twilight CGI baby, anyone? Keep on watching as we discuss some movies which were ruined by bad CGI. Sitting at number 10, The Mummy Trilogy, 1999, 2001, 2008. While The Mummy Trilogy was really cool when it came out, time has not been kind to these Brendan Fraser-led movies. Even when initially released, the special effects came off as funny more than they were scary. These movies are sort of like the Evil Dead series, with all the camp, but sadly none of the charm. And the fact that the CGI wasn't even necessary in some scenes and would have been easily accomplished with costume design and makeup just makes it worse. The first movie had the mummified victims, the second had the weird-looking Scorpion King, and then the awful digital armies in the third one. Despite the visually painful CGI, we'd be lying if we said these aren't great guilty pleasure films though. Next, at number 9, we have The Lawnmower Man, 1992. Released in 1992, the rough Stephen King adaptation could pin the blame on early technology, but that doesn't mean it gets a pass. This movie is a perfect example of how poorly digital effects can age. The Lawnmower Man is a sci-fi horror film that follows Pierce Brosnan as he experiments on a simple gardener to make him smarter. They used very heavy CGI to create what was their interpretation of virtual reality in the early 90s. Though it might have looked fresh and new back then, it just looks unpleasant now. It is somehow uglier than PlayStation cutscenes. And not only does the unsettling, doughy CGI look hideous, age has only made its aesthetic worse. It has become so ugly over the years that it now borders on being scary. You could say that they accomplished their mission, but at what cost? Up next at 8, Star Wars Special Editions, 1997. You probably saw this coming. What do you guys think happens when you take some of the best practical effects in film history and then try to enhance them with unnecessary CGI? Well, it gives birth to some of the worst moments in film industry's most adored franchise. While they did manage to add some welcome changes, George Lucas went on to do some atrocious retrospective editing. The result was overcrowding shots of buildings and creatures, the addition of the horrible Return of the Jedi musical number, making Ewoks blink, and generally messing with what already works so well. If you want to watch what comes out of a director going absolutely mad with CGI power, look no further than this series. Sitting at number 7, Hulk, 2003. While Ang Lee's Hulk didn't have the worst special effects out there, for such a big budget blockbuster, the effects definitely should have been better. Bad CGI wasn't this movie's only problem, but it certainly played a big part. Before this one, the live-action adaptation of Hulk had been done practically, with prosthetics and makeup, but naturally, this movie decided to go bigger. They clearly thought a true adaptation of the character would be a giant-sized green CGI Goliath. It does sound great in theory, but it ended up coming off as far too cartoonish to be taken seriously. And, well, it's better to leave the whole Hulk count situation untouched. Thankfully, the disastrous fate of this movie wasn't the end of live-action Hulk. It was outdone in 2008 by The Incredible Hulk and improved even more since his appearance in MCU's Thor Ragnarok. And at number 6, we have Tron Legacy, 2010. Despite what you may be thinking, Tron Legacy as a whole actually looks really good. The original Tron was groundbreaking when it came to special effects, so its aesthetic needed to be recaptured and also updated in the sequel. While the world overall looks decent, the biggest special effects oddity came in the form of the movie's villain, Clue. The character had the CGI face of a young Jeff Bridges, and it did not look great. This CGI trick has been improved with each attempt made, especially by Disney with movies like Ant-Man, Captain America Civil War, and Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2. But back in 2010, it just wasn't really there yet. Clue looked unnatural, rubbery, and extremely distracting. The movie itself received a mixed reaction as well, but their CGI villain didn't improve anything. Now, at number 5, The Hobbit, The Battle of the Five Armies, 2014. The CGI in The Battle of the Five Armies wasn't outright awful so much as it was painfully mediocre. The unimpressive attempt is made worse by the fact that the original Lord of the Rings trilogy is filled with gorgeous practical effects that still hold up super well today. It's disappointing that this franchise, which looked so breathtaking a decade earlier, took this many steps backward with its prequel trilogy. A significant amount of the costumes, makeup, prosthetics, and the sets of the original trilogy got replaced with CGI and green screens. Of course, it isn't all bad, but some characters looked far too bouncy in action. The locations are missing visual depth, and the armies look so fake that the battle has no impact or emotional effect whatsoever. It is understandable understandable that it's a huge task to be able to repeat the extremely difficult techniques that the original trilogy followed, but it's just hard to go from the absolute masterpiece that was the Battle of Helm's Deep to weird, mushy gray chaos that takes place in the third act of the film. Now, sitting at number 4, Jurassic World, 2015. Like The Hobbit, this is another franchise that is known for its masterful special effects that unfortunately the sequel just couldn't deliver. Ignore all other entries in the franchise, Jurassic Park still looks pretty good. Spielberg utilized both digital and practical effects to create what many people consider to be one of the best hits of his career. While the hugely anticipated Jurassic World showed a lot of promise, it had none of the realism that was a big part of making the original movie great. Complaining about realism when it's a movie about dinosaurs may seem silly, but the CGI in Jurassic World is way too overused, and it didn't really have any sort of impact on the audience. The effects don't capture the depth or intimacy that the original did, and doesn't produce the same fear either. Up next, at number 3, is Gods of Egypt, 2016. Very interesting in theory, a complete mess in execution. 2016's Gods of Egypt was surrounded by whitewashing controversy, critical mockery, and around $140 million worth of pure cringe. Set in a world where Egyptian gods live on Earth, just a bit taller than everyone else, with animorph powers and a heck of gold, you can probably already guess at how much of a dumpster fire this movie turned out to be. But after the meltdown the director Alex Proyas had on social media, we can't really say anything about it that hasn't already been said. All we'll say about the CGI is that it's very unconvincing and looks silly. Despite having a great cast and a strangely huge budget, the film just looks goofy. To be perfectly fair, we're not sure that better-looking digital imagery would have helped out much. For something that is relatively recent, it really has no excuse for looking that bad. And at number 2, the Transformers franchise, 2007 to 2017. At face value, the CGI in the Transformers franchise is pretty decent. You obviously can't make huge alien car robots with practical effects anyway. The imagery here isn't ugly per se, even though it's not exactly the most accurate representation of the cartoon. What is definitely ugly, though, is the way the CGI is used. One of the most common complaints when it comes to the franchise is the action sequences. There are a lot of noisy explosions while the Transformers themselves are brawling with each other on screen. It's not easy to tell who's fighting who, and that's an understatement. You'll find the screen to be filled with flaming, jagged, and unintelligible metal when you sit down to watch these movies. The ongoing misuse of the CGI can be credited to Michael Bay's chaotic, over-the-top style, but that doesn't mean it still isn't hectic and confusing to watch. And the look of the films only go on to get worse with each entry in the franchise, with the visuals becoming even more harder to take in. They also get increasingly noisier. Better visuals cannot save this franchise, and to be honest, we're pretty sure nothing can. But at the very least, Bay should try to craft action sequences that are understandable enough to be memorable and aren't scrapyard explosions. And sitting at number 1, Green Lantern, 2011. There's no doubt that Green Lantern was far from being a hit, but it did have potential. A new superhero was being adapted for a live-action film who could create whatever he wanted out of light with his cool ring. There was a lot to be excited for. Wild alien stuff, Ryan Reynolds, cool cosmic adventures, and a new franchise. But most of us know how that turned out. The movie is uninspiring, no matter how you look at it. Though it has a lot of issues, the CGI is one of the biggest, most obvious ones. The effects were pretty mediocre, but they didn't use them for anything that was original or unique. They relied so heavily on it, in fact, that even Ryan Reynolds' costume was entirely CGI. Some may argue that this was a creative decision. If that's true, it was not a good one. That's a wrap for this video. See you in the next one.